Most people don't realize this at first, but when a fruit tree fails, it's usually not because the soil is bad. It's because the tree and the soil were never meant to work together in the first place. You might have done everything right, added compost, adjusted the pH, watered carefully, maybe even followed every instruction the nursery gave you. And still, the tree struggled, slowly declined, and eventually died. From my experience, that's one of the most frustrating parts of gardening. Not because you didn't try, but because it feels like the land itself is working against you. But here's something that took me a long time to understand. There's no such thing as useless soil. There's only soil that doesn't match the plants we're trying to grow. In many parts of the world, fruit trees have been growing for centuries, in rocky hillsides, in heavy clay that stays wet for weeks, even in sand that dries out almost as soon as it rains. Not because the soil was improved, but because the right trees were planted there. So in this video, I want to walk you through a different way of thinking. Instead of trying to fix your soil, we'll look at fruit trees that already know how to live in it. And more importantly, I'll explain why they survive, what kind of soil each one actually prefers, and where things can still go wrong if we're not paying attention. Because this isn't about planting everything on a list. It's about finding one or two trees that truly fit your land. And once that happens, gardening starts to feel a lot less like a struggle and a lot more like working with nature instead of against it. Before we talk about which trees survive, it helps to understand why so many fruit trees fail in the first place. Because most of the time, it's not just bad soil. It's a mismatch between how the tree grows and how the soil behaves. For example, many common fruit trees, like apples, peaches, and cherries, develop relatively shallow root systems. That works well in loose, well-drained soil. But in heavy clay, those same roots sit in water for too long and slowly begin to suffocate. You might not notice it right away. The leaves can still look healthy for a while, but underground, the roots are already struggling. On the other end, sandy soil creates the opposite problem. Water drains too quickly, nutrients don't stay in place, and shallow roots simply can't keep up. So even if you water regularly, the tree still experiences stress between each watering cycle. And then there's rocky or compacted soil. Roots can't expand easily, so the tree never fully establishes itself. From my experience, this is where many people start trying to fix the soil, adding compost, fertilizers, amendments, and sometimes those things do help, but only up to a point. Because if the soil structure itself doesn't match the tree's natural growth pattern, no amount of feeding will solve that long term. There's also another issue that's less obvious. When we try too hard to help a struggling tree, we often disturb it even more. Watering too frequently, loosening the soil around the roots, constantly adding new inputs, all of that can prevent the tree from adapting. Instead of growing deeper, stronger roots, it becomes dependent on surface conditions staying perfect. And in real gardens, conditions are rarely perfect for long. So the goal isn't to create ideal soil everywhere. It's to understand how your soil behaves and choose trees that already know how to live in it. In the next section, we'll start with trees that actually prefer heavy, wet soil, the kind of ground that usually causes the most frustration. When people think about fruit trees, they usually imagine full sun, dry roots, and well-drained soil. But pawpaw doesn't follow that pattern at all. In fact, it evolved in conditions that would kill most orchard trees. If you walk through parts of the eastern United States, you'll often find pawpaw growing naturally, along riverbanks, in low areas, and in heavy clay soil that stays damp for long periods. That's not an accident. That's exactly the environment it's adapted to. Unlike apples or peaches, pawpaw roots can tolerate lower oxygen levels in the soil. Where other trees begin to suffocate, pawpaw continues to function. And that's why it often succeeds in places where people say, "Nothing ever grows here." But there's something important to understand. Pawpaw doesn't just tolerate wet soil, it also prefers a bit of shade, especially when it's young. From my experience, planting it in full, harsh sun too early can actually slow it down. In its natural habitat, it grows as an understory tree, protected by taller trees above. So giving it filtered light in the first few years can make a big difference. There's also a common mistake people make with pawpaw. They treat it like a standard fruit tree, spacing it far apart, planting just one, and expecting it to produce. But most pawpaw varieties are not reliably self-pollinating. So if you want fruit, you'll usually need at least 2 genetically different trees. Once established, though, pawpaw tends to be low maintenance. It has very few pest and disease issues in most home gardens, and it doesn't require constant feeding or adjustment. It simply grows in a place where other trees struggle. Of course, this doesn't mean it will thrive everywhere. Extremely dry or sandy soil can still be a challenge, and young trees may need consistent moisture to get started. But if your garden has heavy, slow-draining soil, especially in areas that stay damp through spring, pawpaw isn't just an option. It might be one of the few fruit trees that actually feels at home there. Next, we'll look at another plant that goes even further, one that can turn a soggy, forgotten corner of your yard into something productive. If pawpaw survives in wet soil, elderberry takes it a step further. This is one of those plants that doesn't just tolerate poor drainage, it often grows best in it. In many natural settings, you'll find elderberry along stream edges, in low-lying areas, and in soil that stays consistently moist. Places where most fruit trees would struggle with root rot, elderberry continues to grow without much resistance. From my experience, it's one of the few plants that actually benefits from that problem corner in a yard, the spot where water tends to collect after rain. The reason comes down to how it grows. Elderberry develops a dense, fibrous root system that can handle fluctuations in moisture. Instead of needing perfectly aerated soil, it adapts to conditions that change between wet and slightly dry. That flexibility is what makes it reliable in difficult ground. But there's another advantage that often gets overlooked. Elderberry grows quickly. In many cases, you can start harvesting within just a couple of years, even without intensive soil improvement. And over time, it tends to spread, forming a kind of natural hedge that fills in empty space. That can be useful, or it can become something you need to manage. So it helps to think about placement early on. Give it room where spreading isn't a problem, and it can become one of the most productive parts of your garden. There is one important limitation to keep in mind. Elderberry doesn't thrive in dry soil. If the ground dries out frequently, especially during the growing season, the plant may struggle to establish. And while the berries are useful, they're not typically eaten raw. They're most often cooked into syrups, jams, or preserves. So this isn't a pick and eat straight from the tree kind of fruit. It's more of a long-term, practical addition to a garden. But if you have a damp, overlooked area, somewhere other trees have already failed, elderberry can turn that space into something quietly productive. Next, we'll look at another tree that handles heavy soil well, but in a very different way. One that's been quietly growing in traditional orchards for generations. Compared to most modern fruit trees, quince feels almost out of place today. You don't see it often in garden centers, and many people have never tasted the fruit at all. But for generations, quince was a standard part of home orchards, especially in areas with heavy, difficult soil, where other fruit trees struggled to survive. That wasn't by accident. Quince has a natural tolerance for dense, moisture-retaining soil. While apples and pears often suffer in heavy clay, quince roots can continue functioning with fewer problems. Not perfectly, but reliably enough to establish and produce over time. And that's really the key difference. It's not about growing fast, it's about growing steadily in conditions that don't change much. From my experience, quince tends to reward patience. It may not be the quickest tree to start producing, but once it settles in, it becomes surprisingly consistent. There's also a practical advantage that older generations valued. Quince is self-fertile, so even a single tree can produce fruit, which makes it easier to manage in smaller gardens. And the tree itself is quite resilient. It generally faces fewer disease problems than many modern orchard varieties, which means less intervention and less dependency on perfect conditions. But there is one thing that often surprises people. Quince is rarely eaten fresh. The fruit is firm, sometimes astringent, and usually needs to be cooked to develop its flavor. That's why it was traditionally used for jams, jellies, and preserves, foods that could be stored and enjoyed over time. So this isn't a tree for instant rewards. It's a tree for long-term value, especially in gardens where soil conditions don't favor more delicate fruit trees. Of course, there are still limits. Extremely dry or fast-draining soil can make establishment difficult, and like most trees, it benefits from some care early on. But if your garden has heavy clay, soil that stays firm, slow, and sometimes wet, quince is one of the few fruit trees that has quietly handled those conditions for generations. Next, we'll move into a completely different kind of challenge: soil that doesn't hold anything at all, where water and nutrients disappear almost as quickly as they arrive. Most fruit trees take from the soil. They depend on what's already there and often need extra nutrients to stay productive over time. See, buckthorn works a little differently. Instead of only using what's in the soil, it actually adds to it. This plant forms a relationship with soil bacteria that allows it to fix nitrogen from the air. In simple terms, it helps build fertility in places where very little existed before. That's one of the reasons it's used in land restoration projects. Areas with degraded, sandy, or nutrient-poor soil can slowly improve over time with plants like this. But that doesn't mean it's delicate. See, buckthorn is extremely tough. It can survive in dry, sandy soil, in windy coastal areas with salt exposure, and in ground where water drains almost instantly. Conditions that would leave most fruit trees constantly stressed are simply normal for this one. From my experience, the biggest adjustment is not the soil, but the way the plant grows. See, buckthorn tends to spread through suckers. Over time, it can form a dense thicket if left unmanaged. That can be useful for creating natural hedges, but it also means you may need to guide its growth depending on your space. There's also an important detail many people miss. See, buckthorn usually requires both male and female plants to produce fruit. Without pollination, you may end up with a healthy plant but no harvest. And when it does produce, the berries are quite tart. They're rarely eaten fresh, but they're valued for juices, oils, and preserves. So again, This isn't about instant sweetness. It's about long-term resilience and building something where very little used to grow. Of course, it's not the right fit everywhere. In heavy, waterlogged clay, sea buckthorn can struggle to establish. But in dry, sandy, or depleted soil, it's one of the few plants that doesn't just survive, it slowly makes the ground better. Next, we'll look at another tree that handles poor soil well, but instead of improving the soil, it simply asks for very little from it. If sea buckthorn improves the soil over time, jujube takes a different approach. It simply learns to live with whatever soil it's given. In many parts of Asia, jujube has been grown for thousands of years, often in land that would be considered too dry or too poor for most crops. Places with alkaline soil, low organic matter, and long periods without rain. And yet, it continues to produce. One of the reasons is its root system. Jujube develops deep, searching roots that can access moisture far below the surface. So instead of depending on frequent watering, it gradually becomes self-reliant. From my experience, this is where many people get surprised, because after the first couple of years, the tree often needs very little attention at all. It's not just drought tolerance either. Jujube also handles alkaline soil better than most fruit trees. Where other plants show nutrient deficiencies, jujube continues growing without obvious stress. There's also a practical benefit for home gardeners. It tends to have very few pest or disease issues in many regions, partly because it hasn't been widely cultivated everywhere, so fewer problems have adapted specifically to it. But like every tree we've talked about, it's not completely without limits. Jujube doesn't perform well in consistently wet soil. If the ground stays soggy, especially around the roots, it may struggle to establish. And while it's very resilient, fruit production can still vary depending on climate and sunlight. So it's not about neglect. It's about choosing the right conditions and then not overmanaging the plant. If your soil is dry, alkaline, or low in fertility, jujube is one of the few fruit trees that can quietly adapt and still produce. Next, we'll move into a different kind of environment again, rocky, shallow soil, where roots don't have much room to spread, and most trees never fully establish. When people think about improving soil, they usually expect better growth and better results. But fig trees don't always follow that pattern. In fact, in some cases, poorer soil can actually lead to better fruit. If you've ever seen figs growing in the wild, you might have noticed something unusual. They often grow out of rocky ground, cracks in stone walls, or shallow soil where very little else survives. And yet they still produce. The reason has to do with how the tree responds to stress. In rich soil, fig trees tend to focus on leaf and branch growth. They put energy into expanding rather than producing fruit. But in poor, rocky soil, the tree shifts its priorities. With limited resources, it invests more into reproduction, which means more fruit. From my experience, this is one of the most counterintuitive lessons in gardening. Sometimes giving a plant less actually leads to better results. There's also a structural advantage. Rocky or compact soil naturally restricts root expansion, and that mild restriction can help balance the tree's growth. Less uncontrolled vegetative growth, more consistent fruiting. Another practical benefit is simplicity. Many fig varieties don't require pollination to produce fruit, so even a single tree can be productive without needing a complex setup. But like everything we've talked about, there are still limits. Extremely wet soil can still cause problems. If roots sit in water for too long, even a fig tree can struggle. And in colder climates, some varieties may need protection to survive winter. So this isn't about ignoring conditions. It's about understanding how the tree responds to them. If your soil is rocky, shallow, or not very fertile, fig trees don't just tolerate that environment. They often turn it into an advantage. Next, we'll look at a tree that takes this idea even further. One that has been producing fruit for centuries, in soil that barely looks like soil at all. If fig trees can turn poor soil into an advantage, olive trees take that idea even further. In many parts of the Mediterranean, you'll find olive trees growing on hillsides that look almost barren. Thin soil, exposed rock, long, dry summers, conditions that would be considered unsuitable for most fruit trees. And yet, some of these trees have been producing for generations, not years, but decades, even centuries. The reason comes down to how olives are built. They evolved in environments where water is limited and soil depth is minimal. So instead of depending on rich soil, they develop a root system that slowly explores whatever space is available. Cracks in rock, small pockets of soil. Over time, that's enough. Another important detail is how olive trees respond to stress. Like figs, they don't necessarily benefit from overly rich conditions. When soil is too fertile, they often produce more leaves and wood and less fruit. But in lean, well-drained soil, they tend to focus on fruit production instead. From my experience, olives are not fast trees. They take time to establish, and they reward patience more than intervention. But once they settle in, they become incredibly resilient. There's also a practical consideration. Some olive varieties are self-fertile, but others benefit from cross-pollination. So choosing the right variety for your climate and your space matters. And climate itself is an important limit. Olive trees prefer mild winters. In colder regions, only certain hardy varieties can survive reliably. So again, this isn't about planting anywhere without thinking. It's about matching the tree to the conditions you actually have. If your soil is rocky, shallow, and drains quickly, olive trees don't just tolerate that environment, they were shaped by it. Next, we'll move into a different category. Trees that aren't tied to just one type of difficult soil, but can adapt across a wide range of conditions. Up to this point, we've been looking at trees that match specific soil problems: wet soil, dry soil, rocky ground. But mulberry belongs to a different category entirely. It's not just adapted to one condition, it adapts to almost all of them. From my experience, mulberry is one of the few fruit trees that can handle a wide range of soil types without needing much adjustment. Heavy clay, sandy soil, low fertility. It continues to grow where many other trees struggle. Part of that comes from how flexible its root system is. Instead of relying on one specific soil structure, it adjusts its growth depending on what's available. In denser soil, it slows down and stabilizes. In looser soil, it expands more freely. That adaptability is what makes it reliable. It doesn't need perfect conditions. It just needs enough space to establish. Another thing that stands out about mulberry is how quickly it begins producing. In many cases, you can see fruit within just a few years. And once it starts, it tends to produce consistently without much intervention. There's also a practical reason it was so common in older gardens. Fresh mulberries don't store or ship well, so growing them locally was often the only way to enjoy them. But like every tree we've talked about, there are still a few things to keep in mind. Mulberry can grow quite large over time, so spacing and placement matter more than people expect. And the fruit can be messy when it drops, especially near walkways or patios, so it's worth thinking about where you plant it. But in terms of survival, it's one of the most forgiving fruit trees you can grow. If your soil varies across your property, or if you're not sure exactly what you're working with, mulberry is often a safe place to start. Next, we'll look at another tree with a different kind of strength, one that doesn't adapt by flexibility, but by reaching deeper than most other fruit trees can. While some trees survive by adapting to the surface, persimmon takes a different approach. It survives by going deeper. In many parts of North America, persimmon trees were planted in places where other fruit trees simply wouldn't last. Rocky clay, dry ground, soil that looks workable on the surface but quickly becomes harsh below. And yet, persimmon continues to grow. The reason comes down to its root system. Persimmon develops a strong taproot that pushes deep into the soil over time. Instead of relying on surface moisture, it accesses water reserves that other trees can't reach. From my experience, this makes a noticeable difference during dry periods. While shallow-rooted trees begin to show stress, persimmon often remains stable. That deep rooting also helps in rocky or compacted soil. Even when the top layer is difficult, the tree gradually finds pathways downward. It's not fast, but it's persistent. Another advantage is resilience. In many regions, persimmon has very few pest and disease problems, which means less intervention and fewer points of failure over time. There's also flexibility in how it produces. Some varieties are self-fertile, while others benefit from cross-pollination. So again, variety selection matters. And there's one detail many people don't expect. Persimmon fruit often needs time to fully ripen. Before that point, it can be quite astringent and unpleasant to eat. But once it softens, the flavor becomes much sweeter and more complex. So patience plays a role here as well. Of course, even a deep-rooted tree has limits. Extremely waterlogged soil can still cause problems, especially during the early stages of growth. And like all trees, establishment is the most sensitive phase. But if your soil is rocky, dry, or difficult below the surface, persimmon is one of the few fruit trees that can grow past those limitations, instead of being stopped by them. Next, we'll step back from individual trees and look at how to choose the right one for your specific soil conditions. Sometimes the problem isn't what you add to the soil, it's how the roots respond to it. In sandy soil, water moves too quickly, and shallow roots simply can't keep up. Even if you water often, the moisture doesn't stay where the tree needs it. And in compacted soil, it's the opposite problem. Roots don't go deep, not because they don't want to, but because they can't. Over time, this creates a quiet kind of stress. The tree looks fine at first, but it never really establishes itself. From my experience, this is where many fruit trees begin to struggle, without obvious signs early on. It's not always about doing more. Sometimes it's about understanding what the roots are able to do in the soil you already have.